Oh, guys, it is good to be in church this morning. A massive welcome today. If you are joining us online, a massive welcome to you as well. You guys can grab your seats. If I haven't met you before, my name is Ruth, and I have the absolute privilege of being the Generations Pastor here at Bright. And it is my honour today to be able to share the word with you. And, you know, it honestly, anytime that anyone gets up here, there is a responsibility with that, and it's not one to be taken lightly. And so I really do take this as a privilege and an honour to be able to share with you today. We are in the middle of a series at the moment called Issues of the Heart. Now, I personally am loving this series. We have had a week on anger that Pastor Ben spoke about. Pastor Ben also spoke on forgiveness. And Pastor Sarah spoke beautifully last week on Mother's Day about faith and the importance of faith, particularly in a situation where there was a lot of patience required. There was a lot of patience required, and faith was really, really important in the midst of that. Now, I'm not going to tell you just yet what I am preaching on today, because I think that you might be able to guess it. Okay, as I give you a little bit of an example in a moment, I think you'll be able to guess it. But really, this series, Issues of the Heart, it's all about the heart. Okay, that's not a trick. It's all about the heart, because who knows that sometimes our heart can get a bit complicated. Our heart can be amazing and drive us to do all sorts of great and wonderful things and to make great decisions. But it can also drive us to make some pretty poor decisions as well. And if we don't keep it in check, then our heart can actually be a really dangerous thing. And no one is immune. No one is immune to issues of the heart. No one at all. And so it's really important that for each and every single person in here today, myself included, that we are keeping check of that. And that is why this series is so important. And I can hear that my iPad is not on silent, which is very unusual. And when one message comes, many more may follow, so we're going to just turn that one down. Awesome. So, if you are a parent here today, or maybe you were a kid once, now, that qualifies every single person in this room. Okay, so if you're a parent, you'll have seen this more recently, but if you've been a kid once, you might be able to remember back to some of these moments when we're kids. You see, as a child, you could have a toy that is the best toy. The best toy. You love this toy, you've been playing with it for half an hour, which is such an accomplishment for a child. And you're looking at it and you're like, I love it, it's the best, I could play with this all day. Now, it's only the best toy until the person over there, especially if they're your sibling, until they have picked up another toy. And all of a sudden, your toy's no good anymore, you need their toy. That toy is the best toy. It's not fair they've got that toy, you want that one. Or maybe you remember being a child, and even if your parents had measured and filled up the juice to the milliliter in each person's cup, somehow the other sibling, they always have more. Somehow they always have more juice than you. Or how about this one? You could do up a roster for your children if you wanted to for the front seat of the car, but somehow the other child is always going to have the front seat more. Now, this might just be me projecting. I am the youngest of 4 kids. And so as the youngest, you know, we have a tough life. Is unfair sometimes, even though I know the eldest would obviously say the opposite about the youngest. But, you know, there's this thing in life that just tells us life isn't fair. This feeling of jealousy, and that's what we're talking about today, that just tells us that life isn't fair. You know, as we become adults and we kind of look at these things and we're like, that's ridiculous. It's the same amount of juice. By the way, I don't even care. Drink the juice, get in the car, we're going. Okay, we think that is ridiculous. But I'm so convinced that actually this feeling of jealousy that we experience doesn't change so much as we become adults. And that is because it's not a kid issue, it's a human issue. And I'm convinced it doesn't change. The only thing that changes is that adults have bigger toys. Right? Adults just have bigger toys and different things to deal with. Maybe you're here today and you've been doing a little bit of scrolling lately on Instagram or Facebook, and maybe you've been looking through and you're thinking, oh, what a great holiday. Gosh, I'd love to be in Queensland. Is it just me, or does it seem like everyone is going to Queensland at the moment? Every second post, someone's in Queensland, and we think, wow, I would love to be on a holiday in Queensland. Or maybe you're scrolling through and you're thinking, gosh, they got that job. That's the job I wanted. I wish I could be like that. Or, wow, they're so good at that. Wow, look at the car they just got. They must be earning so much money. Gosh, I wish I could have that. That's what I want. You know, whatever that feeling looks like for you, perhaps you're a parent here and you found yourself looking at the way that other children behave and you're thinking, why can't my kids be like that? I want those kids. And maybe you're finding yourself becoming jealous of other parents or the way that they parent. You know, oh, I wish I was a better mother or a father. If I was like them, maybe my kids would love me. You know, it can go so deep, this feeling of jealousy. But when we look at what the scripture says about it, we're going to go to Proverbs 27, verse 4. And there's this short verse there, but it's very powerful. It says, wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? I love the way the New Living Translation puts it. It says, anger is cruel and wrath is like a flood, but jealousy is even more dangerous. Jealousy is dangerous. What an interesting way to describe jealousy. You know, we could read this and go, wow, like, I thought anger was pretty bad. But maybe it's not that bad. Like, if jealousy is worse, maybe anger isn't as bad as what I thought. You know, and the therapist in me, I'm an occupational therapist. I work with kids, and so I talk a lot about emotions. And I can't bring myself to say that anger is all bad or jealousy is all, it's an emotion, okay? But it's when it goes deeper than that and it takes a hold of you and takes a grip of your heart and it starts to change your behaviors, your outcomes, and your view on life, that this becomes a real issue. And so we could look at it and be like, oh, well, the outcomes of anger, you know, it's pretty bad. Jealousy must not be that bad, but that would be the wrong way to read this. You see, we can't lessen the bar of anger, but raise that of jealousy. The writer here, Solomon, he's really trying to prove a point. Now, I think it's worth mentioning at this point that, you know, some people here might be thinking, well, isn't God a jealous God? Doesn't he get jealous of us? So if jealousy is bad, then why does God get jealous? You see, there's a big difference between God being jealous and us being jealous. When God is jealous, he appropriately desires after what already belongs to him. But when we get jealous, we are desiring after things that do not belong to us. And that is very different than the righteous character of a jealous God. Okay, so when we get jealous, it usually is quite bitter. It usually comes from a really selfish place. Whereas when God does it, he is righteous and it already belonged to him anyway. So we see jealousy all throughout the Bible. It's jealousy that drove Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery. It's pretty significant. You know, it's jealousy of the religious leaders in Jesus' day that drove Jesus to the cross, right? The religious leaders were so jealous that they ended up taking action and eventually becoming so angry and jealous of Jesus, they managed to get him onto the cross. Okay, so jealousy, we see it all throughout the Bible, but there is a particular story today that I want to focus on that really deals with this issue of jealousy, and that is the story of Saul and David. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit more about this story in just a moment, but as we're going through today and talking about Saul and David, I think it will become really clear to us how jealousy is destructive and it drowns out any rationale. It's destructive and it drowns out any rationale. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context. If you want to read the story for yourself, perhaps at another time, it's 1 Samuel 18. We're not in there yet. 1 Samuel 15 to 31, okay? Now I'm talking chapters. So that's 16 chapters that it talks about this story. That's a lot of reading. So today what I'm going to do for us is I'm going to do everyone a favour and I'm just going to summarise those 16 chapters in the best that I can and as quickly as I can. So jump back, okay? So where Israel, they have these things called judges. They actually didn't have kings. Israel gets a little bit jealous of the nations around them, ironically, and they're kind of like, God, we want a king. Why do they have a king? We want a king. And so they get jealous that everyone else has a king. God, we want a king. God says, fine, you can have a king. Okay, so he sends a prophet by the name of Samuel to anoint and appoint a king for Israel. And he anoints this man named Saul, who becomes the first king of Israel. Now, King Saul, he starts his reign, and while he's reigning as king, he makes a few mistakes. God had direct commands that he gave to him. And on one occasion in particular, Saul decided to take matters into his own hands. He got really impatient on a matter waiting for what he was supposed to, and he took matters into his own hands and he disobeyed God. Now, when he did this, what happened was God was angry and he said, Saul has disobeyed me, and in that, Saul hasn't trusted me, okay? So he sends the prophet Samuel to say, Saul, you will stay king for your life, but your successor will not be of your own line. Okay, your offspring will not be your successor. Then Saul has the audacity to do it again, and he disobeys God again. And so the prophet Samuel comes to Saul and he says, you will not be king for as long as previously planned. In fact, you will not be king anymore, and still your offspring will not be the successors of you. Okay, so this is where we find Saul. Now, the prophet Samuel has to appoint another king, because if Saul's not going to be king, then someone else will have to be. And so he appoints this shepherd boy named David. Some people might have heard of the story of David and Goliath. This is that David. Okay, I'm not going to go into it too much. All you need to know is that David, this shepherd boy, he kills this giant Goliath with a slingshot and a mighty faith in God, which is really what got Goliath. And after that, he pretty much saves the nation of Israel against the Philistines, and he earns favor with Saul, the king. Okay, now after this, it's as though David can do no wrong. Every battle he goes into, he wins. He just exceeds expectations. I don't know if you've got that person in your life, and it's like they're just good at everything. That was David, okay? So everything he put his hand to was blessed. And he earned a lot of favor with King Saul. He became almost like a son to him. Saul had such a soft spot for him. So everything looked like it was going great until it all changed. And it all changed for Saul. And that's where we're going to pick it up in 1 Samuel 18, verse 6 to 9. It says this, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs of joy, with musical instruments, and the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And this is where it all changed. This was a turning point for Saul because jealousy started to grip his heart. You see, Saul had already lost favor with God because he disobeyed him, and he knew that, okay? So he had lost favor with God. So that meant that Saul's security could not be in the calling that God had for his life, and instead he put it in his popularity and status with people. And so for Saul, when David was praised in a way that seemed higher than him, it started to compromise that security that he had through people and status. And as that happened, he started to let this fear and insecurity come in. So David, who was originally like a protege for Saul, who he was really supportive of, turned Saul from supportive to dangerous toward David, from finding joy in David's victories and battles to instead turning him towards being envious and angry toward David when he would have success. And so Saul sought to kill David. And so he sent men after him, and he went after him himself for a long time to try to kill David. Now you think, I would not go that far. That is ridiculous, okay? I wouldn't go that far. Now, I hope that you wouldn't, okay? It's pretty significant to go and try to murder somebody. But the thing about jealousy is that it is absolutely irrational. Jealousy is irrational. As I said, I work with kids, and so I read a lot of storybooks, okay? And there is this story, there's two books in particular, one that deals with jealousy and one that deals with anger. The one about jealousy is called The Green-Eyed Goblin. The second one about anger is called The Red Beast, okay? And these stories, they have a really great way of using a picture or an illustration of a little creature that when this emotion takes over them, changes who they are. And so in The Red Beast, you've got this little beast, and he's quite cute when he's little, but once he's woken up, his eyes get smaller, his ears get smaller, and his mouth gets bigger. Then you get the green-eyed goblin. And what happens is his nose gets bigger, kind of like Pinocchio. And then this green mist starts to cover the face of the person that the green-eyed goblin has woken up in. And it starts to cover their eyes so they can't see clearly anymore. And it's like a poison, so it starts to tell them lies. And, I think these are actually such great illustrations of what happens in us when we experience this feeling of jealousy, which so often leads to that real anger. I think it's such a good illustration because when we feel this jealousy, what happens is our eyes get smaller and they start to become not so clear by the mist that is around us. We start to believe lies and our ears get smaller so that we're not listening to the rationale of the people around us anymore, but all we can hear is our own thoughts. Have you guys got anyone in your life who's a projector? Okay, I know I was projecting a little bit earlier. Do you have anyone in your life where what they're feeling must be what you're feeling too? Yeah, I can see some smiles around, so I'm guessing there's a few names that might have come to mind. Don't look at them right now. Don't turn around and tell them. But those projectors in your life. Saul, he was a projector. Because that security meant so much to him, that status and popularity with people meant so much to him, and him being king was so important to him and his identity, it meant that when that was threatened by David, he assumed, well, David just wants what I have. David wants the throne. He projected that to David, and so he started to try to hunt him down so that he could no longer be a threat to him. Saul longed after what David had. He longed after the blessing that was on David's life. David, however, was too busy longing after what God had. I'm convinced that David actually wouldn't have cared if he wasn't king. David probably didn't really have that much interest in that in a way. He was just interested after what God had on his life and what God had called him to do. We can listen to this and think, Saul, you really missed the mark. You're a bad person. You really, you've taken this to the nth degree. Saul, you've done bad. Really? We could listen to it and think that, but actually, if we're really honest with ourselves, we're really not that too dissimilar from Saul. Isn't it true that so often we long for status and we desire popularity in our own lives to please people? Isn't it true that we so often desire our own recognition in situations that we start stepping out of our own lane and kind of being like, actually, I like the life they're living. Maybe I'll try to slip into that. Maybe if I copy what they do, then God will put that on my life instead. That we long after the greener grass on the other side. You see, when we do this, we forget that God's plan is actually greater than our own. And that he has a plan for our lives. In the world, there is this way that the world does promote a sense of status and popularity being a currency. It's like status and popularity is what you want. And if we don't keep check of our heart, then what can happen is we can start to take that on as truth in our own lives when we know that as Christians that's not true, because God cares about appearance. God doesn't care about appearance. He does not care about appearance. He cares about attitude. He cares about our attitude. Saul, you see, he was king, right? And so every victory that David had for the nation should have actually been joy for him. It actually, when David was successful, brought glory on Saul because he was king of the nation. Now, if Saul's attitude had have been for the nation, if Saul's attitude had have been towards God's plans and what he wanted, then that might have actually brought some joy to him. But instead, Saul's attitude was about himself. And so when Saul saw David having victories, instead of feeling joyful about it, it just fueled his own insecurity and fear. The thing about insecurity, right, is that it fuels jealousy. And jealousy fuels insecurity. And insecurity fuels jealousy. And jealousy fuels very good. And insecurity fuels and jealousy fuels yeah, you get it, okay? So it is like an endless cycle. Now, if you are insecure here today and you would say, actually, that's something that I've really been struggling with, or maybe you're really discontent, I just want to take a moment to encourage you that no matter where you're at, no matter how you feel, God is the answer to that. God has put a unique purpose and plan on your life, and we don't have to live in a world where we feel insecure or discontent because of the way that our life looks, because God has more for us than that. And so God is the answer, and I want to encourage you with that today. It's really interesting when we look through the story. You see, as I said, Saul had sought out to kill David, right? So he took his army and went to find David and kill him. There were actually 2 occasions where David had the opportunity to kill Saul. There was one point where it talks about Saul relieving himself. The Bible can be very funny sometimes. And David, what he does is he just cuts off a bit of his cloak. And there's another occasion where David could have actually killed Saul as well. On both these occasions, the men say to him, God has surely delivered him into your hand. Like, why don't you kill him? And I think that's a really good question. Why didn't David just take that opportunity and grasp it and kill Saul in that moment? It might have actually made life a lot easier for him. But, I think there is such a lesson to learn in this. The reason that I believe David didn't kill Saul is because if he did that, he would have been grasping it for himself. Whereas David knew that if he was to be king, then that would be a gift that was given only from God in his timing. So often what we can do is we rush ahead and we try to grasp those promises for ourselves outside of God's timing. That's what Saul did. He was trying to grasp something that wasn't actually for him. He was trying to grasp his own victory as opposed to just waiting on gifts from God. And, I think we can so often do that. The problem with us doing it in our own strength is that when we do that, we actually forget that the promises of God aren't for us, but they're to glorify him. And so we make the promise and our life about ourselves as opposed to being about God. If we grasp our own success, it's no longer a gift. Now, don't get me wrong, we need to take an active role, okay? So if you're sitting on your couch and you're like, God's blessings will come and the promise will be fulfilled, and I'm just going to sit here and wait and do absolutely nothing. Please don't do that, okay? We are to take an active role. But the point is that we are to be led by God and not to lead our own victory. Now, you see, Saul, he tried to lead. He tried to go ahead of God. Whereas David, he allowed himself to be led by God instead. Now, it's no surprise here today that actions have consequences, right? Actions have consequences. If I fell right now, please don't happen. If I fell and my wrist was really sore and I couldn't move it, well, what I'm not going to do is go, it'll be right. I probably need to go take some action and do something about it, because that pain is a red flag to me that something else is going on. Right? Similar to a fire alarm. If we smelt smoke and a fire alarm was going off, then we should probably take action, right? Now again, hopefully that doesn't happen, but we should probably take action. There is a red flag, which is the alarm and the smoke, and we take action. And if we didn't take that action, the results could be devastating and very destructive. In the same way, we need to make sure that we are actually taking action when these things happen. We're taking action when we notice these red flags. Allowing jealousy to take place in our heart has its consequences too. It might hurt you. It might break relationships and destroy relationships around you. It might fuel that insecurity or discontentment that we talked about. It might make you bitter. It might increase anxiety or depression. But I can guarantee you this. I can guarantee you that if you let jealousy take a hold of your heart, you won't be able to love people in the way that God has asked you to. You won't be able to love people like God has asked you to, because if you're jealous, it's really hard to celebrate in the successes of other people and to encourage them in their own walk if you're jealous of where they're headed. Saul, he became jealous because he was comparing his life with the life that God had placed on someone else. And there's this saying, comparison is a trap. And I actually say this to myself all the time, scrolling. Love to be on a holiday. Comparison's a trap, Ruth. Comparison's a trap. Don't fall into it. Okay, but I think that we can actually take it one step further. Comparison, I would say, is actually the bait of the trap, because we have an opportunity as to whether we take it or not. You see, it's very tempting at times. But if you take that temptation, then comparison will be the bait of a trap that you will never win against. You know, have you ever wanted something that someone else had? If you say no to yourself right now, you're either lying to us or to yourself, because it is innate in us, even as children, as we were talking about, we always want what someone else has. You know, jealousy can stem from comparison. But don't we also know that as Christians that everything that we have is to glorify God? So I suppose the question then becomes, what could we possibly know that we don't have that God doesn't know about? You know, oh God, if I just had that job, or if I had that income, God, I'd be able to do so much for you. God, I'd be able to step into what you've asked me to do. You know, God, if I had that personality, then I'd be able to step out and talk to those people. If I had that, they just do that because that's their personality. If I had that personality, I'd be able to love people and share your gospel, share your good news with them. You know, God, if I just looked like that, then I'd be able to talk to anyone. I'd be able to tell anyone about you. What could we possibly think that we have that God doesn't know about? Because God, let me remind us all today, is our provider. He has a unique purpose and plan for your life. You see, we have all been forgiven the same debt. And what I mean by that is we have this problem in our life. It's called sin. Sin is anything that has missed the mark of what God had for us. Okay, so anything where we have missed the mark, that is considered sin. And this is a big problem because what it does is it separates us from a pure and righteous God. Now, God, he loves you and he wants to have a relationship with you. So what he did is he sent his son Jesus, and Jesus lived a perfect life because who knows, we are totally incapable of that. And God knew that, so he sent Jesus, and he had Jesus live a perfect life. And then Jesus went to the cross, and he paid the penalty, which was death. He paid the penalty for sin, which was death, and he took all of our sin, past, future, present, for every single person that lived and was to live. He took that upon himself when he died on the cross. And in being raised again, he defeated the power of sin. He defeated that death. And that means that we can have relationship with him. Now, what Jesus didn't do was, well, now that I did that for you, do this for me. He doesn't do that. In fact, he actually forgives us of that debt. And every person in this room, no one person is better than anyone else. You're not better than the person to your left or your right. I'm not better than you. You're not better than me. We have all been forgiven the same debt. We have all got provision and purpose from the same God. He knows what you need and what you have. So what is there to be jealous of? You know, Amy Robinson, who leads our events and operations space, she said this the other week when we were talking about jealousy. And I loved what she said. She said, jealousy means someone else's win is my loss. Someone else's win is my loss. It actually just wasn't your lane to walk in the first place. But so often we can believe this, that someone else's win is our own loss. You know, jealousy has the power to be able to turn something that could be beautiful, to turn something good, and to create disorder. Think about, you know, maybe a promotion that you wanted. Think about something that you wanted that somebody else had. Instead of being really happy for them and embracing that good and beautiful moment in their life, what we can so easily do is change our own heart and start to create disorder in that relationship with them. Not because of anything they did, but just because of what they have. You know, wherever there is jealousy, there is disorder. And we know that because jealousy is not of God, it is of the enemy. And wherever the enemy is at play in our hearts, there will be disorder all around us. You know, it's so true of the world today that so many things, if we didn't allow the issues of the heart to come and take over, we could probably be a lot more joyful and happy in the world around us rather than seeing so much division. Saul, he idolized materialism over God's commands. He idolized what he thought was best over what God had asked him to do. And then he idolized his kingship, his status, his reputation over God's plan and over the nation of Israel. And when we're jealous, it's really likely that what we're doing is we're actually idolizing things over God or idolizing things over his plan for us. and his provision for us. Because the thing about when we're jealous is we start to neglect seeing how God is working in our life. Sometimes what you need to do is, instead of looking around at all the people around you, and instead of looking at them and being like, look what God's doing in their life and their life and their life, is actually just start to look at how God is moving in your life. It can be very easy to look at the way that he's moving in everyone else's, but neglect to actually see the way that he's moving in our own. Jealousy can stem from comparison, from a lack of thankfulness, from idolizing things over God, also from perceiving growth as something that is of this world as opposed to kingdom gains. It can look like seeking happiness and chasing happiness. But at the root of it all, whatever it is, at the root of it all is a desire for oneself and our own personal gain over others and over others' successes. See, jealousy ends where selflessness and thankfulness begin. Selflessness and thankfulness are the antidote to jealousy. Think about it. If Saul was selfless and thankful, how could have the story of his life played out differently? There's this really interesting parallel that I wanted to share with you that I found when I was researching for this message. You see, Prophet Samuel, who I told you about earlier, he was actually trained by a man named Eli. Now, Eli was a priest and had a great call of God on his life. But Eli also had some sons who were ratbags, essentially. And what his sons did is they created disorder in the temple. Now, Eli, he was responsible for the temple. He was responsible for making sure that everything was in order, and he couldn't get his sons in check. And so in doing that, God was angry about that, and Eli actually lost that call, that plan that was on his life. And God said, I'm going to raise up somebody else, and that was Samuel. Now, what Eli could have done is he could have gone, you know what, I'm not having a part of this. God, I'm so angry with you. He could have had no part of it. He could have been jealous of Samuel, but he didn't do that. Instead, he raised him and he trained him so that he could live out the purpose that God had put on his life. Eli still left a legacy because he chose to honor God. Instead of becoming jealous, he chose to honor God. I wonder how Saul's life could have played out differently. Jealousy is acting like the world around you. It's seeking worldly things for worldly gain from a worldly heart. Selflessness, however, is after God's heart. You see, it was jealousy that destroyed Saul's potential, but it was Jesus' selflessness that saved us all. If we look in James 3, he has something to say about jealousy. And James says this in chapter 3, verses 14 to 16. He says, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes from above, but is earthly and spiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." I think that puts it pretty clearly right there. And it's so powerful. You see, when we are acting out of selfish ambition, what we're doing is we're willingly saying, for my own personal gain, I'm creating disorder. It is willingly creating division in order to achieve your own personal power or status. Again, it's not that we have to be passive. It's not that it's not that you can never want more for your life, but just want what God wants. It's about trusting God and following the plan that he has. It's about allowing yourself to be led by God. And when you do that, there's this thing that happens where we're set free from having to promote ourselves, to seek our own advancement, because we're just so content with trusting in what God has for us. We see this example not only in Jesus and his selflessness, but also in Paul. You see, Paul, he was a man who was thrown into prison for his faith. He was a man that did it tough. But he says in his writings, I count it all as joy. And you know why he could say that? It's because he wasn't interested in himself. He wasn't about his own interests, but he was about one thing, and that is that the good news of the gospel, that message of Jesus that I told you earlier, that was furthered, that people knew about Jesus and the good news of who he was and what he had for them. You see, we don't have time to be distracted by our own interests. When we become jealous of what we don't have or who we're not, we start to become distracted and we lose time in a very short life that we have. You know, there is a world out there who needs to know Jesus. And when we become distracted, we're wasting time about sharing about who he is. And honestly, you're better than that. I'm better than that. You're better than that. We're better than that. Did you know that we have an average of 60,000 thoughts a day? That's a lot of thinking. Maybe some of us think less than others. I don't know. Husbands, wives don't look at each other. I don't know where that dynamic sits. But an average of 60,000 thoughts a day. You know, the thing about our thoughts is they're thoughts, not facts. Just because you think a thought doesn't mean it has to be a fact. You know, oh gosh, if I looked like that, if I had that income, I could fill in the blank. That doesn't have to be a fact just because you thought it. You know, it's so important that we're aware of our thoughts. When you're in school, you might have played a game called Capture the Flag. Well, in life, we play a game called Capture the Thought. Okay? Capture the thought. You know, I'm not talking about just like, oh, I love those shoes, I want that. And then you move on, you don't really think about it. I'm talking about when it's deeper than that. I'm talking about when jealousy grabs a hold of your heart and it changes your perspective on life. As I said before, there are some red flags. There are some things that when we see them, if we don't take action, the results can be disastrous. The results can be devastating. So what we need to do is we need to turn on our heart detector. No one's immune to the issues of the heart. So we all need to make sure that we are, what the Bible says to do is be on guard of our heart. One other thing we can do is to be thankful. Be thankful for what you have. Be thankful for the way that God has moved in your life. Be thankful for the way that he is moving. And be thankful for what you know that he's going to do. And to be selfless. As I said earlier, if we're not selfless, it's really hard to rejoice in the successes of other people. And if we do that, then we can't love how God has asked us to, which means we can't live out the purpose and the call that he has asked us to. So that means that if we're not selfless, then we're actually selling ourselves short of the life that God has put on our life. And not only that, but we won't be able to effectively share the good news of Jesus. So when jealousy stirs in your heart, choose selflessness, choose thankfulness, because they're the antidote to the destructive power that jealousy can have in our lives. We're going to ask everyone to stand, and I want to give people an opportunity to respond today. You know, as we talked about, jealousy can look like so many different things. And I don't know how that plays in your life, but I know that God is the answer. If you're here today and you feel like you're at risk of letting jealousy start to change your perspective, if you find yourself thinking things like, if I had that then, if you find yourself doing that and living your life from that position, I want to give you an opportunity to respond now. So I'm going to get everyone to close their eyes for a bit of privacy. And if you can just raise your hand just so that I know who I'm praying for, and just as a physical sign to say, God, you know, I'm taking this seriously. And God, I'm not going to let jealousy rule in my heart. Just as a declaration, God, I'm not going to let that rule my heart. I'm going to take a moment to pray now. Jesus, you're just so good to us. And God, we thank you that you've given us all that we need for the purposes that you have put on our life. God, I pray that we would choose selflessness, that we would choose thankfulness. And God, we thank you that you empower us for what we need. I pray that you would give every single person here today clarity on where you have called them and on the way that you are moving in their life. God, I pray for each person here today that we would choose to look at the way that you are moving in our life as opposed to the way that you're moving in everyone else's. And that as we see how you're moving in other people's lives, that we would only see it as an encouragement in our own life. God, I pray we would be so loving of each other, Lord, and so encouraging of one another and the people around us as they get maybe what we wanted, because we see your purpose and your plan in it. We love you, God, and we thank you that you are enough. Amen. Amen.